I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? This is Cain's response when God comes asking about the whereabouts of Cain's brother Abel. Now Cain knows good and well where his brother is. It's just a short time before that Cain has killed his brother in cold blood. But this is the beginning of a question that the worshipers of Yahweh and then the followers of Jesus will continue to ask. Am I my brother's keeper? Or in other words, am I responsible for the well-being of another? Why should I care? The shortest book of the Old Testament, Obadiah, is another reflection on this same question. In this book, the prophet named Obadiah is speaking against the nation called Edom because of their disregard for their neighboring nation, Judah. There are some differences in the story of the brothers Cain and Abel and the neighboring nations, Edom and Judah. Cain is directly responsible for the death of his brother, while in the account of Obadiah, Edom is a bystander to the destruction of Judah. But the question is still the same. Am I my brother's keeper? Interestingly enough, in verse 12, the nation of Judah is referred to as the brother of Edom. In fact, throughout the book, there is a hearkening back to another sibling rivalry in Genesis, that of Jacob and Esau. As you might recall, these twin brothers were in competition even in the womb, with Jacob grabbing onto Esau's heel at the time of their birth. And so it is with these two neighboring nations, Edom and Judah. Edom is known as the descendants of Esau, and Judah the descendants of Jacob, and these nations carry on the feud of their founding brothers. Edom is named as an enemy of Israel during the reign of Solomon and is subdued under the reign of David. The Hebrew Bible is filled with stories of Edom's mistreatment of Judah. And in the account of Obadiah, which is the longest description we have of the actions of the Edomites during the fall of Judah, the people of Edom watch while their neighbors are destroyed. They are bystanders to Judah's downfall. In 1968, psychologists in America became interested in the role of the bystander in instances of harm to another. This was following the murder of a woman in New York City, in which it appeared that no one came to her rescue despite hearing her screams. Since then, much has been done to look at the effect of being part of a crowd in the response of an emergency. Certainly, there are many instances where people don't step in to help the person in need, and this can be attributed to a few different reasons. Some assume that someone else will step in and help, perhaps someone more qualified or someone that the person knows. In other instances, people evaluate the situation and determine that it's not worth stepping in, either because the person deserves what's happening to them or it's too great a risk. Or perhaps most disturbingly, there's the mob mentality, in which people can be influenced by others around them to react in a certain way, like laughing at a victim or videoing a victim instead of stepping in to help. The interesting part of this research is that more and more psychologists are finding that it's very difficult to just be a passive bystander. That even when you choose not to respond in the situation that you see, that somehow you walk away changed. This can be for the better or for the worse. Being a bystander to violence emboldens some to go out and perpetrate violence. But for others, it emboldens them to go out and live with an intense commitment for helping others. Being a bystander to violence calls forth a response in us. For Edom, their bystanding did call forth a response, but not the one you would hope. They didn't just watch. In verse 12, they gloat and rejoice over the misfortune of Judah. In 13, they enter the gates of the city and join in the looting. In 14, They capture the refugees who are fleeing from the calamity and turn them over to the attacking army. There's an escalation of the Edomites' callousness that turns them from just a bystander to a perpetrator. One key finding in the studies on bystanders is, quote, how responsible we feel for others at risk depends on how closely we relate to them. Do we see them as similar to us, or do we see them as different? For the Edomites, over the years, they have come to realize so strongly that Judah is their enemy that they fail to recognize the sin of their complicity in Judah's suffering. This is what happens when we see folks as the enemy. We go from simply standing by while they suffer, to taking pleasure in their suffering, to furthering their suffering, to becoming the perpetrator ourselves. Though we didn't begin the mistreatment, we allowed it to continue and grow. These two nations are supposed to be brothers. Instead, they forget who they are in relation to one another. Am I my brother's keeper? In the opening of Obadiah, we watch as the callousness of Edom continues to grow. And then in verse 15, there's a shift. From that point forward, the book of Obadiah begins to prophesy about what will become of Edom. It follows an ancient philosophy of retribution. As you have done, so it will be done to you. Edom allowed and then participated in the destruction of Judah. Therefore, Edom will be destroyed and brought low. The very people that Edom allowed to be brought low will be placed in power over Edom by God's own hand. Today, we might call that karma, baby. But like Zechariah, which Jim preached about last week, Obadiah here is speaking out of anger. And remember, you don't preach angry. This is what Obadiah hopes will happen to Edom. But there's no proof that this did happen in history or will happen in the future. There's no proof that Judah will come back to possess the lands of Edom. And don't we do this same thing? To wish that the person who has perpetrated evil and malice on another could just get a taste of their own medicine. Partly because we want them to understand what it feels like, and partly because we want them to suffer. We even point the finger at God, at those who offend, the finger of God, at those who offend us, to give ourselves the reassurance that God is on our side, not theirs. But isn't it rare that karma actually happens? That people receive their just punishment? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Isn't it really more like an apple for a croissant or a piece of chocolate for a donkey? Isn't it just that we will all inevitably prosper at certain times and suffer at certain times? These things are out of our control and not experienced equally by every human or every nation. Is it God's hand that will bring low a nation for its repulsive behavior? Or is it the inevitable rising and falling of cultures? I don't know. But I do know that no nation has lasted throughout time. War or famine or natural disaster has caused the downfall of many a strong nation. Time will change them all. What if it's more like we've lost our way if we see our neighbor, our brother, our sister in peril, and choose to revel in it? What kind of nation are we if we look with pleasure on the destruction of others? Perhaps our own wound began to fester when we decided to not come to the aid of our brother. Our wound grows with each of these instances of escalation and disregard for others. We become weaker because our brother, is weaker. Nothing is isolated in this world. What is done to one is done to all. And this is not a punishment, but an outcome of a world highly entangled and codependent. We actually get an answer to the question, am I my brother's keeper, in the Bible. In the Old Testament, when reaping crops, landowners were told to leave some fruit on the vine for, quote, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. And what those people didn't eat, it was left for the wild animals. In the giving of the 10 Commandments, the majority of the commandments have to do with how we deal with one another respectfully. And in both of these instances, the gleaning laws and the giving of the 10 Commandments, God reminds the Israelites that they were once slaves in Egypt. Why? Because this reminds them to relate to people who are suffering. And of course, in the New Testament, we have the example of Jesus himself, who specifically went out to heal those who suffered at the hand of society. The parable of the Good Samaritan makes it crystal clear who we have an obligation to, even to the person that we are told is most dissimilar, even to the person that we are supposed to despise. They are our neighbor. They are our brother. The Bible is unapologetic in this regard. It's a resounding yes to the question, am I my brother's keeper? We are called not to be a bystander, but to be an upstander. And not for fear of divine punishment or justice, but out of recognition of divine brotherhood and sisterhood. Because to disregard our brother is not God's way, it's our way. We are choosing in that moment to take our eyes off of God. We are in that moment losing our way to God. This is why we care for our brother, because that is God's way for us. Henry Nouwen puts it like this, quote, in the kingdom of God, there is no competition or rivalry. The Son of God shares his chosenness with us all. In the kingdom of God, each person is precious and unique, and each person has been given eyes to see the chosenness of others and to rejoice in it. What if we were to rejoice in the chosenness of others instead of rejoicing in their suffering? Cain says, I do not know the whereabouts of Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? God responds, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Or in other words, you are your brother's brother, and that should make all the difference. Amen.